So we might just get started in the interest of time. I would like to say, first of all, good morning to everyone and welcome to this webinar entitled Emerging Research, Dementia and Speech and Language Therapy. My name is Vanessa Moore. I'm the Scientific Project Manager for DRNI. We're delighted to see so many of you here interested to find out more about all things dementia and speech and language therapy research. We have two brilliant speakers with us today, Lisa Sheridan and Dr. Suzanna Dooley, who will tell us more about their research. Before I hand over to them, I just want to say that we're hoping to have some time at the end of the session for questions. So any questions that you get, please just pop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Or the chat box. There might be a chance the chat box is disabled, but I'll try to fix that once I go off screen. So bear with me with that, but otherwise the Q&A box should absolutely be working. So feel free to type questions as they come up. There's no need to wait till the end. So if you have any questions, just pop them in the box and hopefully we'll get to them towards the end. Right, so I will now introduce our first speaker, who's Lisa Sheridan. You're very welcome here today, Lisa. And thanks so much for agreeing to take part in the webinar. Lisa Sheridan is a clinical speech and language therapist in the Institute of Memory and Cognition in Tallaght University Hospital, with a particular interest in language and cognition and vast experience in assessing complex communication difficulties as part of the Regional Specialist Memory Clinic, which is in TUH. Lisa will discuss assessment of speech and language skills in a memory service and will focus on research trends, examining the use of speech and language features as digital biomarkers for identifying changes in cognition. So over to you, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Vanessa. I'll just share my screen. Right, is that okay, Vanessa? You can see that?
It's perfect. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. Delighted to be here. As Vanessa said, my name is Lisa Sheridan. I'm a clinical specialist speech and language therapist at the Institute of Memory and Cognition in Tallaght University Hospital. So what I'll talk about today is a little bit of a refresher, reminder of our role in dementia and for myself within the Regional Specialist Memory Clinic in Tallaght Hospital. And just looking at the topic today, so SLT research in dementia, I just thought I'd give a little quick overview of some things that are new in research that I found interesting or that are going to impact my practice over the next coming year, particularly within the Regional Specialist Memory Clinic, and things some people might take away if we've SLTs on today. And then I'll talk a little bit about my own research and research we conducted in Tallaght looking at digital biomarkers and speech and language therapy. Okay, so little update and reminder of our role in dementia. So today we'll focus between myself and Suzanna. This is our kind of expertise is in communication in dementia. So today's focus will all be on the SLT role in communication in dementia. So just a little reminder, and if we've any members of the public or anything, this is a little whistle-stop tour on why we should be involved in a person's care with dementia. So we look at informal and formal assessment of communication. We contribute to the differential diagnosis of dementia. We assess and evaluate the person's activities, participation, environment, and any of their own personal factors related to communication. We examine the person's environment. We observe their interactions with communication partners. We can also be involved in intervention, which Suzanna will talk about later. So direct therapy, group therapy, we can introduce compensatory strategies with the person and really encourage them to maximize their participation in their own activities in their daily life. We also look at supporting the person with dementia and their carers, implementing programs that'll maximize the person's participation in communication interactions in their own community, in their day-to-day life, things like life storybooks or communication passports. We can also work with the person with dementia and their family to look at some communication strategies that might help the person day to day. We're also involved in training, so families, carers, staff, other members of the MDT, in how they can support communication with that person. We also promote and support decision-making, inclusion, enablement, and validation and rehab of the person with dementia. We're also involved in improving the evidence base and promote best practice in service provision and develop appropriate care pathways for the person with dementia. So looking at my own role, so I'm in a level 3 regional specialist memory clinic in Tallaght University Hospital. So my role kind of encompasses all of these things that you can see on the screen. Things that I'll focus on today are more around assessment and looking at those top points there. So early identification of cognitive impairment, aiding differential diagnosis among dementia types, which is a huge, huge part of my role, but also involved in all the other areas there. So post-diagnostic support and intervention, establishing baselines prior to any intervention, measuring change in function over time, advocacy, and engaging in research and promoting the research like today. So looking again at my role within a memory clinic, so we know now that specific analysis of a particular language disorder or speech changes can help to identify the presence and nature of dementia, the subtype of dementia, and it can also facilitate earlier diagnosis. We now know, and it's kind of widely recognized now, that speech and language characteristics are one of the most reliable behavioral markers distinguishing among the different dementia types. For SLTs, it's a hugely growing population. We kind of tend to rely a lot on expert opinion and shared knowledge in this area. You know, looking even at the title today of emerging research, even though it's not really an emerging area anymore, it still is. We're relying on, you know, people disseminating their expert opinion or any research or expert knowledge within the field. And any SLTs in this area do have a responsibility to contribute to the vast research landscape that there is at the moment. So I suppose in thinking about why is an early, you know, diagnosis, an accurate diagnosis even important? Like, does it matter if someone just has dementia, or, you know, what difference does it make about subtyping? Well, I suppose, you know, coming from a regional specialist memory clinic where we see lots of people that maybe have atypical changes or are younger, you know, we see people across the spectrum, but an early specialist assessment is really, really hugely important for an accurate diagnosis, which then sets that person on the path to intervention. So, you know, that's really the main goal here. We want an accurate early diagnosis to ensure that the person can access these things that are on screen. So information provision, early brain health education, disease modifying treatments, facilitating decision-making for their future care, establishing care networks locally, so us referring back to their local area, and just avoiding those crisis situations that we all are too familiar with. So that's kind of a little brief overview of what's involved maybe in my role and in other SLT's role in assessment or in memory clinics. So I just wanted to have a quick look at what's new currently in SLT research in dementia. So, you know, globally, not just for from Ireland. So things that I found interesting and that I hope to incorporate into, you know, my own practice over the next year. So looking at a new assessment, the MLSE, looking at staging criteria for PPA across the subtypes, which has been published recently. And then I'll talk about our own kind of research around using speech and language as digital biomarkers for neurodegenerative change. So looking first at the mini linguistic state examination. So this is a clinical instrument that can be used for detection, diagnosis, and classification of patients with those classical syndromes of PPA. So the three different types: logopenic variant, non-fluent, agrammatic variant, or a semantic variant. So it's a brief, reliable, reproducible measure of language competence that's differentially sensitive to the classic PPA syndromes. So this is a brief assessment that can help SLTs distinguish between the three different types of PPA. As we know, there's very few resources available to assess PPA. Usually designed for a separate clinical population. We often look to the stroke population, particularly for those patients or clients that are, you know, early on in their journey and we're really trying to pick up subtle changes. It can be quite hard. So this is a nice new assessment that has come on stream that I would hope to incorporate into our own assessment battery over the coming year. So it takes about 20 minutes to administer. There's 11 tasks in it. It's freely downloadable, which is great. Kind of comes with all the instructions, all the scoring criteria, everything, the pictures. So it's printable. You get like a booklet where the front page are the pictures that you can show the person with dementia or the person that's being assessed. And then on the back, you have your own instructions and scoring criteria. So it's suitable for describing, quantifying, and monitoring language deficits. And the areas or domains that the assessment looks at are motor speech, phonology, semantics, syntax, auditory verbal memory, which as SLTs we know are differentially impaired across the primary progressive aphasia. It can also facilitate screening for cohort-based research, which will be of benefit going into the future and for future therapeutic trials. But it's a nice assessment that, if someone is maybe unsure or, isn't as au fait with some of the other assessments, or finds it quite difficult to assess for PPA. So I just thought it might be something nice that people could incorporate into their own areas if it was useful. Something else that is kind of, a topic at the minute, I often look to UCL and Queen's Square for, newest research in the area of primary progressive aphasia. They're at the lead and really at the forefront of this research. So, they kind of found that there was a gap in this area. So they've come up with this symptom-led staging system for semantic and non-fluent, and then separately one for the logopenic variants of primary progressive aphasia. So it was based on surveys that were given to caregivers that were enrolled in PPA groups in the United Kingdom and Australia about their lived experience of primary progressive aphasia. And this proposed kind of staging scheme and functional impairment severity scale covers kind of three domains of daily living. So communication, non-verbal thinking and personality, and personal care and well-being. So for each of the PPA syndromes. So it's come up with 6 clinical stages covering those domains. So 5 severity labels from pre-symptomatic to severe. And they kind of talk through the associated functional milestones of each of those. So these are some nice articles to have a look at if that's something you're interested in, but it should come down the line, I think, to other centres over the years. But I suppose it was proposed by this group because the PPAs, the primary progressive aphasias, do present this kind of unique diagnostic management challenge that's not really well captured by other functional scales, like say for typical Alzheimer's disease or other dementias. And we now know that this is particularly urgent with the advent of disease-modifying therapies for Alzheimer's disease, that the eligibility of someone with a logopenic variant PPA, as we know, will have is considered an atypical Alzheimer's disease. So it might be hard to kind of stage this client group and see how eligible they are for these disease-modifying treatments if we don't have the correct staging or tools, and they might be pushed into an assessment which is really heavily language weighted. So I think it's quite nice to see, some assessments that are quite sensitive for the PPAs, and then this staging criteria that will let us see what stage of the disease the person is at and help us going forward to see what kind of eligibility or treatments the person is eligible for. I also just wanted to pop in here this nice article again from Queen's Square and UCL, which kind of is helping me in my thoughts about PPA at the minute. So I suppose any SLTs that are on, or anyone with an interest in PPA will know that it's quite a hard diagnosis to get. It's quite a long trajectory of assessments. And this article just kind of talks through, we've come a long way, but actually there's a lot more to go. Now the article itself is, quite highbrow. There's a lot of, there's a lot of talk about pathophysiology and lots of different things that might not be interesting to people. But I wanted to pop it in here to show, particularly for any speech therapists that are on that maybe find it difficult to diagnose a PPA or diagnose the particular subtype, that actually there's still a lot more to do. And, if it seems as clear as mud, like it probably is. And if someone doesn't fit into those nice categories that we have from the 2011 criteria, that's probably the case, and that they probably don't fit into those nice categories. And that if it feels like a minefield, it actually is. So I thought it was just a nice, article to sum up kind of where we are at the minute in terms of research with PPA, that we've come a long way, but actually there's still a long way to go. And, it is still something that SLTs and clinicians in general do still struggle with. So I thought it was a nice one to just, have a look over if you're an SLT and working in the area. So I'll go on to now my own research and the research we're conducting in Tallaght University Hospital, or have conducted. So I suppose a background to this, where we're in a time where disease-modifying treatments and interventions which will target AD or Alzheimer's disease might become widely available and delay the onset or progression. So healthcare facilities are going to need different kind of screening tools to identify those early on in the disease process. It's imperative that clinicians across disciplines can facilitate timely diagnosis and can identify those at the early stages to ensure the person can begin this journey as early as possible. And with this model of care last year, so we have now increased staffing recommendations in speech therapy. There'll be a lot more speech therapists involved in this kind of process than ever before. SLTs working in memory clinics that maybe didn't work there before, or involved in this area that weren't before. So as I've said, we kind of know now that changes in language often precede other really notable cognitive changes in people who go on to develop dementia. But sometimes they're so subtle, and these early stage communication signs are frequently missed. They're quite hard to assess for a lot of the time. But we now know that speech and language features are widely cited as highly sensitive markers for early detection of cognitive impairment. Also, currently, there's use of technology and advances in voice recognition, speech analysis, and AI have resulted in widespread research interest in using these systems to benefit healthcare systems and benefit patients going forward. So the technology that I'm talking about assesses for these minute changes in a person's speech and language output, and it uses this to facilitate the detection of early cognitive changes. So current practices for identifying changes in a person's cognition are usually a result of self-report, family report, someone coming in telling us what they're experiencing at home, what their family members experiencing at home. But often that's when symptoms have already manifested and are quite clear a lot of the time. This won't be sufficient enough to detect people at that really, really early stage going forward, as there might not be huge subjective changes in cognition. And we know that assessment of cognition includes lengthy testing. It's often a lot of diagnostic tests, such as lumbar puncture for CSF biomarkers, MRI brains, FGG PET. So there's this huge research trend at the minute to develop fast, affordable, easily accessed and available diagnostic screening tools. And as we know, the importance of all of this is to facilitate the person to access the correct post-diagnostic support, the correct psychosocial support, and to be able to get involved in those decision-making for future plans early on, as early as we possibly can. So one of the most researched scalable methods that we can use for detecting cognitive changes is in speech and language analysis. So using speech or language as a digital biomarker for identifying cognitive impairment. So what do I mean by a digital biomarker? So a biomarker just measures a normal biological process. And when this biomarker is used using some kind of digital sensing product, it's then called a digital biomarker. So speech and language patterns have been researched more recently as novel biomarkers for identifying cognitive change. So things like linguistic, acoustic, or prosodic features have all been identified as proxy measures for cognitive performance. So this is kind of the background to a study that we've engaged in Tallaght Hospital. So the overall study that we looked at, and I'll just talk about a small part of it, but the overall study that we looked at was analysis of speech and gait characteristics as objective measures of cognitive performance in healthy aging, mild cognitive impairment, and mild dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. So the aim was to characterize cross-sectional and longitudinal differences of speech variability in these groups. to examine the associations between speech and language characteristics and cognitive and gait performance across the three groups, and to investigate the feasibility and challenges to performing language and gait-based assessments in this clinical context, and the potential for use of self-applied phone application assessments. So to look at kind of how someone might, be able to use this technology on their own phone at home, tracking their own speech or gait, which will indicate how their cognition is at that time. So that was kind of the overall study. So for my master's research, as a small part of that, I was kind of thinking about how, SLTs can be involved in this research. So that, like this research is happening more like globally, but there's very few speech and language therapists involved in it. And I kind of was thinking how, from an SLT point of view, what's of interest, what's of use. I always have identified a gap for myself in identifying language deficits that distinguish between healthy controls and people with MCI. So this assessment of language in the population presenting with quite mild or minimal changes is really, really difficult to identify using standard scores or formal assessments. Formal assessments are really, really useful, but they tend to be a little bit more suitable for those who have a little bit of a more advancing cognitive impairment, where the difficulties are more easily identified. And I don't even mean advanced as in very much advanced, even slightly advanced. It's quite hard to tell the changes from a healthy control to a person with mild cognitive impairment. So SLTs and memory services have often relied on informal assessments, tasks, and a combination of using subtests from other formal assessments that we use. And often it relies on, your own kind of expert knowledge or your own knowledge within the field that you're kind of, it's a gut feeling sometimes. So the research I focused on as part of a small part of this overall research was to identify the value of commonly used cognitive linguistic assessments tasks in identifying those with a mild cognitive impairment compared with the healthy controls, and assess if a quick, informal cognitive linguistic assessment completed in digital form, so using a tablet on an app, similar to ones that are used by SLTs, so similar to our kind of pen and paper tests, could be a little bit more targeted and sensitive in identifying those at risk for cognitive impairment. So first, I wanted to examine the tasks that are used regularly in clinical practice by speech therapists and examine if there's a difference between these tasks in a group of healthy controls versus those who had a mild cognitive impairment. So many of the speech and voice digital biomarker tools that have been researched or published haven't been clinically validated yet. Plenty have, but some haven't. But identifying other kind of cognitive linguistic subtests that we use a lot in speech therapy could be used in conjunction with this type of technology, and likely to increase the sensitivity and specificity of those type of tools. So it could be an add-on to some of those apps that are already in development. So the aim, as I said, was to identify if certain cognitive linguistic tasks are effective at distinguishing between people with mild cognitive impairment versus healthy older adults. And you can see the research question and the objectives there. So the groups or the subtests that I looked at were picture description, picture naming, repetition, verbal fluency, reading, list learning, list recall, list recognition, digit span forward and backwards. So kind of a lot of the subtests that we're used to across some of our MDTs, so speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, neuropsychologists, that we would use quite a lot. So it was a quantitative perspective, cross-sectional observational design. Participants with mild cognitive impairment were recruited through our Tallaght memory service, and the healthy controls were recruited through kind of local advertising, or they were friends and family of those that were participating through our memory service. We got background and demographic details, as you can see there. The inclusion criteria, they had to be 50 and over, have adequate literacy skills, and be able to give informed consent with or without their decision supporter. Exclusion criteria, so that someone was excluded if they had a current delirium or an active unstable psychiatric disorder at the time. So there was a couple more bits included as the overall study, but for my part of the research, we used the MoCA for cognition, we used the comprehensive aphasia test, or the CAT, for sentence and paragraph comprehension, as a screen of receptive language skills. So most SLTs will be familiar with that. The cognitive linguistic assessment was completed on tablet device. So this was devised by myself and Professor Sean Kennelly, the director of our the Institute of Memory and Cognition in Tallaght, and the wider research team. So we transformed that into like a digital form with the app developers that we were working with. So we had it in an app form on a tablet device, with all of those subtests that I talked about a second ago. We also had an anxiety and depression screen. And then we did have a home-based picture description task for all the groups. So they got to continue it at home, just a quick picture description task on their own phone, just to see how people got on with that in their own house as well, and using their own device. So you can see there, that's kind of how it looked. So a common picture that we're all well used to, and some picture naming tasks there. So the subtests that were included, you can see there, which I've already discussed. The targets were either fully created by the research team, so we came up with targets ourselves for certain subtests, or we used lower frequency targets from some of the traditional assessments, so the Boston naming or the QAB. But we use lower frequency targets because, the type of client group it was, we were looking at those very subtle changes. So we wanted lower, less common frequency targets. So I used raw scores to examine the cognitive linguistic subtests myself, and then other voice recorded data will be manually analysed for acoustic, prosodic, and linguistic features. So we're working with neural engineering in Trinity, and then voice recorded data, so the machine learning bit will also be analysed by our industry partners. So the overall study was conducted over a year ago. I then went on maternity leave straight away the minute we finished. So there's still a lot kind of in progress at the minute, and a lot that we're still analysing. So I'll just talk about the results from my own research, that the aims that I discussed at the start. So we had 40 in the group, so 20 in the healthy control group and 20 in the MCI group. You can see their age, education level, and MoCA score there. So what we found was there was a statistical significance across groups using the Mann-Whitney. So in the subtests of picture naming, list learning, list recall, and list recognition. And repetition did show us quite promising results then. So we would hope that it would be significant with a larger sample. Almost all the language-specific subtests showed differences in linguistic characteristics across the groups. And higher mean scores were observed in picture naming, repetition at single word and sentence level, verbal fluency, and correct information units in picture description in the healthy control group compared with the MCI group. So some of the limitations, obviously the sample size is quite a small sample. We didn't have any visuospatial task. The scores weren't weighted. The MCI subtypes weren't examined. And obviously you need a certain environment for digital assessment, so Wi-Fi, quiet space, etc. So I suppose this was just a small study, and, it set us on the path of just looking at this area and what SLT could kind of bring to the area. They've highlighted that picture naming and repetition from this assessment that we've used were potentially successful in identifying those subtle changes between the healthy control group versus the MCI group from a speech kind of assessment perspective. And then the more traditional cognitive assessments, list learning, list recall, and list recognition were potentially successful also. So the current literature based in research focuses on a combination of acoustic and linguistic variables, and this has identified some quick subtests that could be used alongside this automated speech analysis. So it's just, SLTs often find it difficult to identify those subtle changes in someone's profile, and we just wanted to see if we could facilitate this type of assessment. We also just wanted to look at how viable doing a digital modality cognitive linguistic assessment was using a tablet and an app, and it really worked well, and it was quite fast, easy to use, and in busy settings where we rely on informal assessments, this is hugely important, and where time is of the essence. yeah, I'll just finish up here. But the aim of the study was to understand the objective values of these assessments, but unsurprisingly, there's a wealth of other knowledge from the combined assessments, whether they were statistically significant or not. And we know that this assessment looked at, it was a screening tool. So it's not to discredit the value of further complete cognitive linguistic and neuropsych testing that give a complete profile. This was a very specific task we were looking at. And I suppose overall, I just wanted to share this today because I feel that maybe SLTs need to recognize their own importance in this area and, you know, what we can contribute to this area. It's a really exciting part of research that's going on at the minute in dementia care. And from a Tallaght point of view, we've further collaborations this year. So we'll complete some more of the analysis on the study we've done, and going into this year, we'll look at how screening using these type of applications might aid with prioritization in our memory clinic going forward. So I'll finish up there. Thank you very much. So I'll hand it back to Vanessa now.
So thanks a million. Thanks so much for a very interesting, very informative presentation. Just in the interest of time, I'll go straight now to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Suzanna Dooley. Thanks so much for being here today, Suzanna. Dr. Suzanna Dooley is a clinical specialist speech and language therapist in communication and dementia based in the Mass Clinic in St. Columcille Hospital. Her teaching, practice and research focuses on the assessment of cognitive communication disorders in dementia and the development of communication interventions for people with dementia and their supporters. Today, Suzanna will speak on her work and research in the memory clinic, as well as recent and planned research in the area of conversation coaching with people with dementia, including those with primary progressive aphasia. So the floor is yours, Suzanna.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm just going to share my screen now. Can you see that okay? Great. Okay, so yeah, as Vanessa said, I'm going to talk, I suppose, focus mainly more so on looking at interventions for people with dementia and their supporters. I'm based in St. Columcille Hospital, and I work there, as Vanessa said, in the memory clinic. So generally, when we think about the cognitive changes associated with dementia, we think about skills like memory, perception, behavior. But it's important also to realize that people with dementia will all have some changes in their communication ability. So that's why, you know, as SLTs, we're kind of focusing on, I'm very interested in conversation skills of people, even pre-diagnosis. And like as Lisa alluded to there, you know, there are a lot of subtle changes that maybe an SLT might be able to notice that mightn't be very obvious initially when somebody is having some initial changes in the cognitive impact on the person's communication. So in everyday terms, what does that mean? Well, that means that people will have trouble keeping track of what's being said, expressing their thoughts and ideas, being able to tell a story in a cohesive way, maybe find a turn at a conversation, like it's my turn to talk, initiate, or maybe sometimes they talk a little bit too much or a little bit too little. And it's hard for them because they have difficulty accessing core vocabulary, so speech can be hesitant and maybe have some fluency difficulties. Also, when we think about communication, we think a lot about talking. And really, it's important for us to focus on all the other communication skills that we have, like attending to conversation, processing, understanding, problem solving, reasoning, and all of these are subtle communication skills, along with the ability to read and write. And this is the area that SLTs focus on in their work. So because the communication ability of people with dementia is impaired, you know, we're going to notice that they're going to have trouble with social interactions, and it does impact their relationships. And that's why early intervention is very important for people with dementia, that we help preserve their connections, their relationships, and their ability to participate in the activities that they love. So in our work with people with dementia, we're very focused on what the client wants, trying to keep the therapy functional, success orientated, looking at what they can do rather than what they can't do, and working with them and their families to identify what they want to work on, what's important from them from a communication perspective, because every person we meet is going to have different communication needs and wants. And this can involve modifying the communication environment, exploring existing and new activities for them, and helping them to keep connected and engaged. Before I go on to just introduce the research that I'm working on, I'm going to just flag up this really good e-learning tool that was developed in conjunction with Matthew Gibb in DSIDC in St. James's. It's called Speech and Language Therapy Practice in Dementia Care, and it's a great learning tool particularly for speech and language therapists. It's a 2-module tool looking at the assessment and management of people with dementia. So the link is there for you, and if you can log on, it's a free resource, and I'd highly recommend it for anybody working in the area. So today I'm going to look at the research that we're working on in St. Columcille and St. Vincent's University Hospital, and we have been doing over the last few years. I won't have time to go into huge detail on these individual projects, but I'll try and give you an overview and share all the links with you so you can go and explore a bit further if anything takes your interest. So first I'm going to talk about the PCAD, which is an assessment tool called Profiling Communication Ability in Dementia. And then I'm going to look at a feasibility study that we ran 2 years ago called Conversation Coaching with People with Dementia. And also I will briefly talk about a collaboration that we had with Maynooth University on the Triadics project. And if I have time, I'll introduce you to our Let's Talk PPA group and talk about our research priorities for the next while. So starting off with the PCAD, this was started out, I suppose, as a little assessment that I developed in St. Columcille for working on the wards with patients. It was an informal tool, and I talked to Professor Margaret Walsh in Trinity about how I might validate this tool for use in clinical practice. Because we had very few tools going back 5 years ago, 6, 7 years ago, that we could actually use to profile communication in dementia. So what ensued then was Margaret ended up applying for HRB funding, and a huge project that took 4 years. I think I'm just about finishing it now, and ended up me also doing a PhD as part of this research. So it was a very large project. It had multiple phases. So in broad strokes, it had 3 large phases. So the first phase was the refinement and development of the original tool that we had, and that involved engaging with an expert group and having some focus groups to determine what was important to the different service users and stakeholders. Then we had to repilot it and refine it. The second phase of the project was validating then the final tool that we had, and that was done in Ireland and in Canada. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And then the final phase, thankfully, that I'm on to now has involved publishing the paper, the validation paper, and actually publishing the test, the PCAD test, to make it available for speech and language therapists in practice. So what does the PCAD do? It evaluates the communication abilities of the person with dementia, and it helps create an individualized profile of what their strengths and weaknesses. It also helps identify strategies, so it kind of has an intervention wing to it, so it helps guide practice, helps identify what works well for that person. It forms a good basis for communication partner training, and that means it's a type of therapy where the clinician works with a person with dementia and a significant other to, I suppose, improve their conversation ability by putting in supports, identifying what's working well, and maybe trying to reduce troublesome communication strategies or behaviours that maybe have emerged. And the PCAD can also be used then to track changes in communication abilities over time. So I was delighted when I got this email last week to say finally the research paper is being published, and I want to thank my collaborators, mainly and primarily Professor Margaret Walsh in Trinity, also Tammy Hopper in the University of Alberta in Canada, and Dr. Rachel Doyle in St. Columcille and Vincent's Hospital, and Dr. Orla Gilheeney, who works in Clontarf Hospital. So this research project, as I said, this part was kind of the second phase of the PCAD project, which was validating the tool. And this was coordinated between multiple sites in Ireland, including St. James's Hospital, Tallaght University, Piedmont Hospital, the Living Well with Dementia communities in Stillorgan, Blackrock, and also in Tipperary. Along with community in Alberta, in Edmonton, in Canada, with the help and support of Professor Tammy Hopper. So we recruited 100 people in Ireland, with dementia and 100 supporters. So in effect, we had 200 participants in Ireland and we had 44 participants in Canada. So I won't have time to go into huge detail on, I suppose, the methodology, but it's all there in the paper. But we basically measured PCAD against concurrent measures. So that means we measured against other similar tests. So we measured against the FLCI, which is a Functional Linguistic Communication Inventory. And we use the MMSE2 for staging. And we also use the Global Deterioration Scale for staging of dementia types, levels. And what we found was that, I suppose, what do we know already? We knew in advance that there were very few tools for speech and language therapists for assessing communication. And we knew that all people with dementia are going to have communication difficulties. So what did the PCAD add? It now provides us with the validated tool. So we found that there was good, strong, reliable concurrent validity with the measures that we used, and also very good inter-rater reliability for the PCAD. So we're delighted with those outcomes. We know too that PCAD identifies the type and level of communication support required as dementia progresses. So what that means is that if someone has on the PCAD, if they have a mild cognitive communication impairment, they're going to need minimum communication support. If they have a moderate communication impairment, they're going to need moderate support, and so on. But we also found that this completely coordinated with the stages of dementia, early, mid, and late stage dementia. So that was a very, very important finding of the research. So we're delighted now that it is available for use in clinical practice, and it can be used with people at different stages and severity of dementia across different kind of settings. And on the back of the test, there is a summary sheet that we encourage to be used by the healthcare team, and it can be used as part of the healthcare record to share, I suppose, communication abilities of the person. I suppose that was one of the fundamental drivers of this assessment, is looking at what people can do rather than what they can't do. So using the PCAD summary to guide the conversations, the clinical conversations, decision-making conversations that we have in healthcare, and that I suppose influence healthcare decision-making. Okay, so that's the PCAD, and it's available now. And I suppose that was a very, very important outcome of our research after all those years, that we now have the product. So it's great that clinicians can now avail of it as one of the tools that they might use in clinical practice. So the second piece of research I'm going to talk about this morning is conversation coaching in dementia. This is a type of therapy that we've been running in St. Columcille Hospital for many years, maybe 5 or 6 years, working very closely with my colleague Sophie Fiore, who's a speech and language therapist in the hospital. And we decided 2 years ago to try and validate it, or do a feasibility study on the intervention, so that we could share it with other clinicians in practice. So what are the goals of conversation coaching? To provide early education on the way that dementia impacts communication, to provide psychosocial support for people with dementia and their significant others, to enable people to identify what's working well and increase their awareness of their individual communication challenges, to help them generate strategies that will support their communication, and to encourage participants to remain active and engaged more in their local community. This paper was published in the European Journal of Geriatric Medicine in February 2024, with the support of Dr. Shane O'Hanlon in St. Vincent's Hospital. So it's there. I think I've left the link in there for you if you want to have a look at the full paper. But just in broad strokes, the aim of this research was to check the feasibility of this intervention and examine its effectiveness on the outcomes that we had selected. So what we were looking at was, would the CCI impact the communication function of the person? Would it help them improve their own communication goals? And would it impact their well-being and the well-being of their significant others? The method was perspective within subject design method. We recruited 34 people, which was great. given that it was at the kind of tail end of COVID. So we were delighted with that group number. So the intervention framework is a one-to-one therapy and group sessions facilitated by 2 speech and language therapists over 6 weeks. And that was myself and Sophie Fiore. And we use these outcome measures, PCAD, the ICE-CAP, and the goal attainment scaling. Here's an overview of what the program looks like. So you'll see the beginning, middle, and end. The people have a group workshop or session and 2 individual therapy sessions as part of the intervention. So the outcome measures we used, as I said, were the PCAD, the assessment I've just described. For quality of life, we use the ICE-CAP-A capability measure, which looks at 5 different aspects of quality of life, including security, ability to maintain relationships, finding love and support, and those type of parameters of well-being. And then we also asked the participants themselves to identify their own communication goals, and we use that as a measure using the goal attainment scaling. So as I said, in terms of participants, people had to have a diagnosis of dementia and mild moderate cognitive communication difficulty, as confirmed by the PCAD, and be available to attend sessions, including follow-up, and have an available communication partner. So we recruited 34 people. In terms of, we ended up with, here's the breakdown in terms of the participants with dementia. So we had 8 men and 9 women, and they had a split of people with vascular dementia and Alzheimer's dementia. In terms of communication partners, we had spouses and also children of people with dementia. So results then, we had 28 people completed the whole intervention. 6 didn't participate due to COVID and for personal reasons. And then we did the follow-up outcome measures in 3 to 6 month period after the intervention. So as I said, we had used the PCAD. So in terms of PCAD scoring, we had 67% of the participants stayed the same. 26% got a slightly higher score, which you mightn't expect with people with dementia. They would have improved communication, but just showed that by changing the communication of the partner and also improving their own awareness of their communication, it was possible for them to improve in their conversation measures. But 7% of them didn't improve after had a little drop in their score. So in terms of the ICE-CAP then, which is the well-being measure for the people with dementia, we had 69% had an increased score and 37% stayed the same. And then looking at the partners of the people with dementia, 77% of them got a higher score and 23% stayed the same. In terms of the goal attainment scaling, just to give you a flavour for the types of goals that people generated, they wanted to meet others in the same boat, to understand each other's conversation better. Where the partners also wanted to learn more about dementia, be more involved in conversation, be able to keep track and be able to manage word finding problems in conversation. So in terms of goal attainment scaling, these were the results in terms of meeting their own goals. So as you can see there with the partners and the people with dementia, a good chunk of them were in the better than expected range, which is very, very satisfying. So here's some of their individual feedback. I won't have time to read through it all, but I feel everybody joined in and had opportunity to say their piece. It was extremely helpful, understanding, life-giving and supportive. So a lot of positive feedback. Among the key findings, so we obviously that it's a feasible intervention for people with dementia. Communication function as measured was either maintained or improved. Feedback from all the participants indicated that it's an acceptable intervention. It's collaborative with the person and their family, and further analysis, there's more work to be done on some of the data that we collected, so that's for another day. So we were keen after that, Sophie and I, to develop this, as I had said, into a training pack for SLTs so that we could share the research. So in March of this year, we had 25 speech therapists came to the hospital, and we developed a train the trainer pack based on this intervention, and we've shared it with the first batch of speech therapists. So we're hoping in 2025 that we can continue that work and disseminate the intervention further. Okay, so I'm now oh yeah, sorry, and also just to say that in this year we've just actually got ethical approval through, which is great, to adapt this intervention for people with PPA and their supporters. So as Lisa was saying earlier, the needs of people with PPA and the communication impairment is more classic aphasia with a changing trajectory. So people with PPA need more bespoke intervention. So we've already engaged PPI involvement for this collaboration and to change the design and content, and hoping to begin recruitment now in January for this project. And we don't have any research funding at the moment, but hopefully we can secure a small grant to help us get that off the ground. So that'll be the next phase of the conversation coaching research. I also mentioned that we had collaborated with the psychology department in the NUI Maynooth on a project they were running, a large-scale project called the Triadics Project. And one wing of it was working with people, adapting it and tailoring it for people with PPA. So they used St. Columcille as one of their research sites, and I was very happy to get involved and support them in this work. So they came with a view to, I suppose, creating a bespoke intervention for people with PPA, and they met with the group, and the group, it had started out as a reminiscence group, and once they met the group, by the end of the group, they were planning to do Tai Chi, walking and music. So it took on legs, and it went a whole other direction. But it did still include the reminiscence focus. So this research was led by Dr. Alexandra Dinius and Dr. Roach in Maynooth. So in terms of the measures that they use, their questionnaires had to be adapted for people with aphasia. So we helped them with that. It just meant that it was more accessible and easier to use for the participants. Here's a picture of our group just doing a Tai Chi session on Zoom with the Tai Chi master. And so they absolutely loved that. That was very different. I just have a little bit of feedback from that group. This paper hasn't been fully written up yet, but just some initial feedback from the reminiscence, questions on the reminiscence piece. You can see there on your screen. So I wouldn't have reminisced often before this program. It was very interesting. I could remember inside and outside more than I anticipated. I like this comment down here. The best part of this activity was when people started talking about things. Oh, I did this, and someone will say, oh, and I did that too. And then you connect with people. You get lovely conversation. So some nice feedback from the participants on that intervention. I suppose some of the key takeaways for me as part of this collaboration were that people with PPA can be involved, and it's important to have them involved at the PPI stage in terms of design and content. That people with primary progressive aphasia were supportive of this bespoke nature of this intervention. In fact, they drove it. Communication strategies were needed and were used to facilitate feedback. So their feedback could be given maybe one at a time rather than a group. The discussions were clear and direct. Multiple choice questions and picture symbols were used to help people to vote their answers. That planning improves accessibility. So to give people the material in advance and to prepare notes, decrease the worry and anticipation of each session. And that assessment and intervention tools were modified to facilitate the participation of people with communication impairment for PPI and engagement with the intervention. So just a quick check of the time, maybe a few minutes just to talk about the Let's Talk group, which is a post diagnostic intervention support that we have in St. Columcille Hospital. So the purpose of this group is for people with PPA to meet, talk and support each other. The group was set up in Columcille in 2021. It's held in a large rehabilitation room and facilitated by 2 speech and language therapists. In order to be involved in the group, you need a diagnosis of PPA to want to be a part of a group and to be able to come regularly and have adequate hearing to be able to get involved in group conversations. So we generally have 7 people at each session, plus or minus 2 or 3. There's some turnover in the group where people, maybe move on to one-to-one therapy and new clients come in as they get diagnosed. So we get our referrals from the SLTs and from the dementia clinic from St. Vincent's Hospital and also St. Columcille's, and from the community care region, the regional specialist memory clinic, and the mass support clinics as well. So there is a small waiting period of up to maybe 6 weeks to get into the group. So at the beginning of 2023, we decided to ask the group why were they coming to group and what did they want out of the group. So we asked them 2 questions: why do you come to group, and what activities do you enjoy? So we had a kind of group discussion with kind of supported picture symbols to help people to identify their choices and their topics. So they were asked, why do you come to group? And the top reasons they identified were to understand more about PPA, that would have opportunities to talk with other people, to improve my confidence, I feel better after the sessions, and to have regular contact with the SLT. What activities do you enjoy? And they were given a choice and they had to just identify their top 3. And this group came up with these activities. So including art, museums and walks, relaxation, and interestingly, having coffee, and forest bathing and music. So that was that group in 2023. In 2024, we focused on embracing nature as our theme. And then this year, our focus is going to be on art and culture. So this group meets once a month, as I said, to provide support, but also we meet in the hospital. We also have outings maybe 2-3 times a year. We have a great partnership going with the National Gallery of Ireland, and Caoimhin McAnummer he's an education officer there, and he's great to facilitate our tours and workshops within the gallery. And our group members absolutely love going to the gallery. Here's a few pictures from some of our outings. I think we maybe went to Kilrudder here, and some of our drawing sessions that we had with Caoimhin and Mags Hartnett, who's the art therapist there in the gallery. So final takeaway points from this morning's sessions. I just want to, I suppose, highlight that we need more funded research in the area of communication dementia. We need to have more SLTs in post in the regional specialist memory clinics across Ireland, not just in the big urban centres. We need SLTs in mass clinics and more SLTs in community teams working with people with dementia. We know that people with dementia are interested and willing to get involved in communication research. People with dementia and their families benefit from speech and language therapy, and that has been our experience. But it's important that research design takes on board the needs of people with dementia and help to make the research accessible so that they can easily get involved in research from the point of view of the patient information leaflets, questionnaires, and timing of sessions. So I think I'll just finish up there on that. I hope it wasn't too much information in 20 minutes. Thanks, handing back over to Vanessa.
That's great, Susanna. Thanks a million. Thanks for that. Really, really interesting. Very thorough, very interesting. I'm just super conscious of time. We have 2 minutes to go before we officially are over time. So I might just ask both of our speakers to come on camera, and we'll just maybe try to get to 1 or 2 of the questions, if that's okay. So the first question that we have here is, how common is PPA and how common is the logopenic variant? I know Lisa or Susanna, whoever one of you.
Yeah, I suppose we don't have actual specific numbers for PPA because it's the disease itself we look at. So logopenic variant PPA will be Alzheimer's disease pathology, and Alzheimer's disease will be the disease the person lives with. Or if it's semantic or non-fluent, it could end up being a frontotemporal dementia. So the PPAs are considered rare. Overall, say for an FTD, we're looking at probably 10 to 15% of our total numbers. So total numbers in Ireland are probably like 65,000. So about 10 to 15% of that. And then logopenic variant would be an atypical form of atypical Alzheimer's disease. So a small portion of the Alzheimer's disease group as well.
And there was another question here. Would you use the MLSE in your initial assessment with someone presenting with cognitive communication changes, or would you use this after having used other assessment tools to help specify PPA variant?
Yeah, I would probably have gathered from my case history and from talking to the person and their family that it is looking like, language-led dementia. And you could have done some of your other, maybe more specific aphasia tests to look for language impairment. And then the MLSE could be an add-on to check for which subtype the person is fitting into a little more so. So yeah, I use it as a combination with other things.
Now, I'm very sorry for those of you who had asked questions that we're not getting to, but it's 12 o'clock now, so we should probably wrap up. But I just want to let everybody know that this webinar has been recorded. It'll be available on the DRNI YouTube page. It should be posted in the next couple of days, and you can also find our previous webinars there, so that's available. So just to finish up, to say thank you to everybody who attended, and a absolutely huge thank you to our wonderful speakers, Lisa Sheridan and Suzanna Dooley. It's been really great to hear about speech and language therapy, all the research going on, all the great work that you're doing. So thank you so much for giving your time today and for your excellent presentations. So that's just to wrap up then. Hope everybody has a good rest of the day, and thanks very much.
Thanks,
Thank
Vanessa.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.